Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through stacks of sources, articles, research notes, pulling out the key insights so you can get informed, maybe find some surprising facts, and hopefully stay hooked along the way.
And today, we're diving into Jerusalem, a city sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also, kind of ironically, a place of constant, intense conflict.
It really is. And our mission today, using the sources we've gathered, is to unpack some of that complexity. We'll look at the competing claims, where the name Palestine even comes from, and the forces that really shaped its modern story.
We're starting with, well, a building, or a rather magnificent one, the King David Hotel.
Right, built back in 1931 by Ezra Mosseri, an Egyptian Jewish banker.
Yeah.
Pink limestone overlooking Mount Zion. But this place, it was way more than just a luxury hotel.
Oh, absolutely. It saw pretty much every major event, every upheaval in 20th century Palestine. It was like a front row seat.
It even housed royalty on the run.
Yeah.
You had Alfonso XIII of Spain there in 31.
Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia in 36, escaping the Italian invasion.
And King George II of Greece in 42, fleeing the Nazis. Quite the guest list.
And beyond that, a whole section, the Southern Bloc, became the official nerve center for the British Mandate. It was the HQ for British forces in Palestine and Transjordan.
And that role, being the heart of British power, well, that set the stage for something dramatic. Let's jump to July 22nd, 1946.
Okay, so on that day, members of the Irgun, which was a Zionist underground group, got into the hotel. They were disguised as Arab workers, hotel waiters.
And they managed to plant explosives down in the basement of the main building.
The explosion that followed was catastrophic. It completely destroyed the western part of that southern wing. 91 people were killed, dozens more badly injured.
And this wasn't just random violence, was it? The sources are pretty clear.
Not at all. It was very calculated. The objective was to destroy secret documents the British had seized just a month before during something called Operation Agatha.
Right, documents that apparently exposed Zionist militant activities in Palestine.
Exactly. So the bombing was direct retaliation, a message to the British for uncovering and, well, potentially acting on that information.
So the key takeaway here isn't just the tragedy, but the strategic impact. This attack really shook the British administration.
It exposed their vulnerability. You know, even a major colonial power facing that kind of targeted resistance realized maybe they couldn't hold on to Palestine.
And it pushed them, ultimately, to hand the whole problem over to the United Nations.
Which is a huge turning point. But before we get there, let's dig into the deeper history, the roots of the conflict, starting with a really fundamental question. Who were the original inhabitants, today's Palestinians?
Oh, it's heavily debated, obviously. From the Jewish perspective, based on the Hebrew Bible, the original inhabitants of Canaan were Jews, descendants of Abraham. They saw it as returning to their ancestral land after, periods of wandering.
And the Bible also mentions the Philistines, or Pelisets, describes them as arriving from the Aegean Sea around the 12th century BCE, always warring with the Jews, later the Romans.
And in that view, modern Palestinians are often seen as descended from those Philistines.
There's archaeological evidence cited for this, too. You've got ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, 12th century BCE, like in Ramesses III's tomb, mentioning the Pelisets.
And more recently, there was the Leon Levy expedition in Ashkelon, DNA testing, carbon dating on hundreds of graves.
Right, led by Daniel Master. The results, which came out in 2019, are presented as supporting that sea people theory for the Philistines, which kind of aligns with the biblical story.
Okay, but there's a strong counter-argument. Palestinian historians like Professor Nur Masala, they really challenge this whole narrative.
They do. Masala, for instance, argues that portraying the Pelisets as, quote, aggressive foreign invaders was basically propaganda written into the Bible later to demonize an enemy.
He even questions the evidence itself, suggests it might be, manufactured or biased.
Yes, he raises that possibility regarding Egyptian records, excavations, even the DNA sampling, and he points to the funding of the Leon Levy study.
Ah, the foundation being funded by wealthy American Jews.
Exactly, leading him to call it a Jewish biblical retrojection, basically, reading modern politics back into ancient history.
It's fascinating how even the names become battlegrounds. We've talked before about Emperor Hadrian renaming Judea to Syria Palestina after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century CE. The common story is he did it just to spite the Jews.
And while that might have been part of it, our sources suggest it was also, strategic. A military move after crushing the revolt, trying to erase the Jewish connection.
But crucially, the name Philistia, or something like it wasn't new, was it?
Not at all. It was
Oh,
already around. Greek historians like Herodotus used Palestine, Syria way back in the 5th century BCE to describe the area between Phoenicia and Egypt,
right.
long before the Hebrew texts were finalized.
So Adrian was sort of incorporating an existing ancient name with southern Syria, not just pulling it out of thin air to offend.
Precisely. And Jerusalem's name shifted too, reflecting who was in charge. Hadrian called it Aelia Capitolina.
Aelia from his family name, Capitolina from Jupiter. And that name actually stuck for quite a while.
Around 500 years, yeah. Then the Arabs conquered in 638 CE, and Aelia became Ilia. It was also known as Beit el-Maqdis.
Until the 10th century. Then what?
An 11th century Persian traveler, Nasir Khusraw, noted people were calling it Al-Quds, the Holy, a name Palestinians still use today.
So the names themselves tell a story of shifting power and identity.
Absolutely. And for the wider region, that Roman name, Syria-Palestina, eventually just shortened to Palestina.
And it wasn't obscure. Roman writers used it. Strabo, Pliny the Elder, even Jewish writers like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria.
Right. It shows the name Palestine for the region isn't accidental. It has this long, documented history.
Okay, so let's shift focus to the more recent past. The late 19th, early 20th century, this period of massive change with Jewish return, or Aliyah.
Yes, Aliyah. It's Hebrew for ascension. Signifies both a physical move and a kind of spiritual elevation, returning to the sacred land.
The first Aliyah started in the late 1800s, mostly Russian Jewish families. They established some of the first modern Jewish settlements, Petah Tikva, Rosh Pina.
And then came the second Aliyah, starting around 1904. That brought about 40,000 more Jewish immigrants over the next decade, right up to World War I.
To grasp the impact, we need to look at who was actually there before this started, say, in the 1880s.
Okay. Demographically, it was overwhelmingly Arab. Muslim Arabs were somewhere between 400,000 and 450,000 people. That's like 85% of the population.
And Christian Arabs.
A smaller group, maybe 40,000, 50,000, so 10%.
And Jews.
A very small minority then, only about 20,000, 25,000 people, just 5-6% of the total.
And land ownership mirrored that?
Pretty much. Arab Muslims own around 85% of the land. Arab Christians, maybe 5-7%. The established Jewish community, the old Yishuv, they owned very little, just 2-3%.
And a huge chunk was walk land.
Over half, yeah. Religious endowments, often tied up, not easily bought or sold.
So into this landscape comes this large-scale Jewish immigration. The impact must have been huge.
Our sources say the Arab communities were thunderstruck. Land they'd farmed for generations was suddenly being sold, fenced off, used for different purposes. Villages started changing. Hebrew signs popped up in markets.
And you mentioned the language barrier creating anxiety. Hearing Hebrew, which most Arabs didn't understand, felt secretive, maybe threatening.
Exactly. It fed into this growing sense of unease, of potentially being displaced in their own land.
And this is where we see the beginnings of organized Palestinian Arab nationalism.
Right. A really key development was the newspaper Palestine, Palestine, founded in Jaffa in 1911 by two Palestinian Christian cousins, Isa and Yusuf al-Isa.
What was its initial focus?
At first, it was more about internal community issues, like Greek clerical influence over Arab orthodoxy, but it quickly shifted.
To the issue of Jewish immigration.
Yes, that became the dominant concern. Palestine started running editorials warning about what it called Zionist conspiracies, mass immigration, land purchases, violations of native rights.
Highlighting specific examples, Jews buying villages, displacing Arab workers.
Exactly. And crucially, the paper started addressing its readers, both Muslim and Christian Arabs, as Palestinians. It was a conscious move to build a shared identity, challenging the British label of just non-Jewish population.
So it became a symbol, a torch of light, as one source puts it, for this emerging Palestinian identity.
In contrast to Aliyah, which was seen as a firefly of prosperity for Jews, different perspectives on the same events.
This growing sense of identity led to political organization.
Yes, the first Muslim-Christian associations formed. Jaffa's in 1918 declared Palestine an Arab country, rejecting Zionist claims. The Jerusalem Association became a major center for anti-Zionist politics.
And they held congresses.
The first Palestinian Arab Congress was in early 1919. They sent a message to the Paris Peace Conference demanding the Balfour Declaration be revoked and asking for an independent Palestine, possibly linked with Syria under Faisal Hashimi.
And the Third Congress in 1920.
That one was even more direct. Demanded Palestine be part of an independent Arab republic, flat out opposed the Jewish homeland plan, rejected the World Zionist Organization, and didn't want Hebrew as an official language.
They explicitly warned about immigration causing conflict.
Yes, they saw the demographic shift coming and warned it would inevitably lead to trouble.
Okay, so while Palestinian nationalism is organizing, what's happening on the Jewish side in terms of security?
Well, after incidents like the Nebi Musa riots in 1920 and Jaffa riots in 21, where Jews were attacked and property damaged, Jewish leaders felt the British weren't adequately protecting them.
So they decided to take matters into their own hands.
Essentially, yes, this led to the formation of the Haganah, an underground Zionist military force.
Its purpose was defensive, protecting settlements, kibbutzim.
Initially, yes, protect Jewish communities from attacks. Its first commander was Yosef Hecht, a young veteran. They started acquiring weapons covertly.
Smuggling them in. I read something about beehives.
Yes, hidden in beehives, refrigerators, anything to get past customs. They brought in experienced trainers, too, like a sharpshooter named Avner.
And the Haganah saw action pretty quickly.
Their first major test was November 2nd, 1921. An Arab mob attacked the Jewish HQ in Jerusalem's Old City. But this time, armed Haganah members were there. They fired back, repelled the attack.
A significant moment.
Absolutely. Our sources call it a turning point. The first time there was this direct eye-for-an-eye armed response from the Jewish community in Palestine. They weren't just relying on the British anymore.
But the source also says this basically ignited continuous armed conflict between Arabs and Jews.
Yes, it escalated things significantly. It marked the start of a new, more violent phase.
So you have these two paths diverging sharply: Jewish immigration building new settlements, fueled by hope and organization,
While Arab communities felt they were losing ground, watching their land disappear.
the experience of someone like Golda Meir, who came from Milwaukee, really captures the Zionist perspective, doesn't it?
Yes.
Seeing Palestine as this final sanctuary.
Yes, and she told this story, this anecdote.
The cotton pillow story.
Right. How a Jew could sell a pillow for £1, join a loan society, get a £10 loan, put a down payment on land, even get a house built by giving a floor to the contractor.
It sounds almost unbelievable. How did that work?
It worked because of the systems they built. Loan societies, collective networks, the political backing of the Zionist movement. There was organized support.
Which the Arab population largely lacked.
Correct. They didn't have those kinds of networks or financial structures to compete effectively for land or jobs against the influx of organized immigrants. They were, as the source puts it, watching foreigners with foreign documents backed by the British buy up their ancestral lands.
This fundamental clash inevitably led to more friction, more violence. The Western Wall conflict in 1929 seems like a major flashpoint.
It really was. You have the holiest site for Jews, the remnant of the Second Temple, but it's physically part of the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, which is Islamic Waqf property, and holds the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site.
Because of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the Barak legend.
Exactly. So you have these incredibly deep, overlapping sacred claims. Conflict was almost built in.
And in 1929, it boiled over because of chairs.
Basically, yes. The mosque authorities banned Jews from bringing chairs or benches to the wall, even for the elderly. This caused huge resentment among Jews.
And led to protests.
Joseph Klausner formed a pro-Wailing Wall committee. On August 14th, thousands of Jewish youths marched around the old city walls.
And the Arab side responded.
2 days later, after Friday prayers, the Supreme Muslim Council organized a counter-demonstration at the wall. Tensions just skyrocketed.
Then violence broke out.
On August 23rd, Arab youths attacked Jewish civilians in the Old City. It spread fast. Then came major attacks on Jewish settlements. On the 25th, a British report called one most ferocious, 60 Jews killed in hours.
And safe, too.
Yes, on the 26th, mobs attacked Jewish areas in Safed, killing 45. Thousands of Jews had to flee their homes, which were then looted and burned.
The immediate violence died down, but the hatred lingered.
Intensely, and it was actively stoked. That leaflet from September 29, distributed by Arab students, is chilling.
Calling Jews the bitter enemy, blaming them for crucifying Jesus, poisoning Muhammad, urging boycotts.
It's pure incitement, drawing on ancient anti-Semitic tropes.
And a source draws a parallel to the stab-in-the-back myth in post-WWI Germany.
Yes, showing how these toxic narratives blaming a minority group for wider problems can gain traction and have devastating consequences. Similar things were being said openly in Palestine.
And all this is happening as the situation for Jews in Europe is deteriorating rapidly, leading up to the Holocaust, which of course would drive even more desperate immigration to Palestine.
A truly tragic convergence, and amidst this rising tension, another strand of Zionism gains prominence: revisionist Zionism.
Founded by Zeev Jabotinsky, challenging the mainstream Zionists like Chaim Weissman.
Right. The core idea was territorial maximalism. Not just a Jewish homeland, but a greater Israel across all of Mandate Palestine and Transjordan. Clear borders, strong sovereignty.
Very different from the more gradual approach of Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionists buying land, building kibbutzim.
Much more confrontational. Revisionists pushed for mass immigration, a strong Jewish military, defined borders. This inevitably meant more clashes with Arabs and the British. They weren't interested in compromise, even with other Zionists.
And this ideology had a lasting impact on Israeli politics.
Absolutely. It's the foundation of the Israeli right wing. Think Harut, then Likud Begin, Shamir, Sharon, Netanyahu all come from this political lineage.
And revisionism had its own military arm, too.
Yes, the Irgun, which we mentioned earlier, bombing the King David Hotel. Jabotinsky led it initially. The British considered it a terrorist group. The Stern Gang later split off from Irgun.
So attempts at negotiation were failing. I see a note about Ben-Gurion meeting a Palestinian leader in 1934.
Yes, Ben-Gurion and Judah Magnus met Ani Abd al-Hadi. Ben-Gurion apparently offered Zionist support for Arab independence struggles elsewhere.
If they would accept Jewish return to Palestine.
But Abd al-Hadi's response was firm. No compromise on Palestine, even for a bigger Arab nation.
Meanwhile, Jewish immigration, especially from Nazi Germany, was skyrocketing. The British were getting alarmed.
Definitely. You had secret memos about illegal immigration. The numbers were stark. 42,000 in 34, then over 61,000 in 35.
This led to the Peel Commission in 1937, their solution.
Partition, a two-state solution. But the proposed Jewish state was tiny and fragmented. It excluded key areas.
And they wanted to limit Jewish immigration.
Severely. Only 12,000 a year for 5 years. Jerusalem would stay under British control.
How did that go down?
Badly all around. Zionists rejected the small borders, Arabs rejected the very idea of a Jewish state, and ramped up attacks on the British.
So partition failed. What next?
The White Paper of 1939, Britain basically reversed course, drafted by Malcolm MacDonald.
This imposed even stricter limits on Jewish immigration.
Draconian limits. Only 75,000 more Jews allowed over 5 years than a complete stop. And it proposed eventual majority rule, which meant Arab rule.
Effectively killing the idea of a Jewish state. A betrayal from the Zionist perspective.
Absolutely. Seen as reneging on the Balfour Declaration promise entirely.
And then, September 1st, 1939, World War II begins. How did this change the dynamic in Palestine?
Ben-Gurion made that famous statement, "We will fight the war as if there was no white paper, and we will fight the white paper as if there was no war."
Meaning?
Meaning they'd support the Allies against Hitler, but they wouldn't stop fighting British restrictions on immigration and land purchase. The Haganah stepped up covert operations, smuggling Jews, smuggling weapons. They even started rudimentary pilot training.
And Churchill's rise changed British policy slightly.
His view was pragmatic. If Jews wanted to fight Nazis, arm them. So more weapons flowed to the Jewish community, even while official policy restricted them. A real paradox. Then came another tragedy, the Patriot disaster in 1940.
The British were trying to deport nearly 1,800 Jewish refugees.
Yes, deport them to Mauritius. The Haganah saw this as treachery and decided to disable the ship, the SS Patria, while it was docked in Haifa. They planted explosives.
But it went wrong.
Horribly wrong. The explosion was much bigger than intended. It sank the ship, and over 250 of those Jewish refugees were killed.
Haganah called it a mistake, a miscalculation.
They did. But our sources note skepticism, suggesting it could have been a deliberate warning or even a calculated sacrifice to shock the British and world opinion about the desperation for immigration. The truth remains murky, given the secrecy.
So even after the war, with the Holocaust revealed, Britain didn't change its immigration policy.
No. Despite Jewish support for the Allies, Britain stuck to the White Paper limits. In early 46, they blocked a key refugee escape route from Austria through Italy. That was really the final straw for the Zionists.
Leading to more attacks on British targets, like the King David bombing.
Exactly. The violence became uncontrollable, international pressure mounted. Finally, on February 15, 1947, Britain announced it was giving up, handing the Palestine problem to the UN.
Both sides prepared their cases. The Arabs argued they shouldn't pay for Hitler's crimes.
While Ben-Gurion argued Jewish refugees weren't displacing Arabs, but settling in newly built Jewish towns and villages developed through decades of their own labor.
The UN set up a committee, UNSCOP.
Yes, an 11-nation committee. They investigated, traveled, heard testimony. Their report came out September 1st, 1947.
And they recommended
Partition again. 2 independent states, Jewish and Arab, with Jerusalem under international control.
how were the proposed states divided demographically?
The Jewish state would have about 500,000 Jews, but also over 400,000 Arabs, a very mixed population. The Arab state would be mostly Arab, around 750,000, with only about 10,000 Jews. Jerusalem was to be separate, international.
Reactions?
The Palestinian Arab leadership completely rejected it. Any two-state idea was out. The Jewish leadership, while unhappy with the borders, accepted it as a basis for negotiation. They'd get a state.
So it went to a vote at the UN General Assembly, November 29, 1947.
And it passed. 33 nations voted for partition, 13 against. 10 abstained, including Britain itself.
Who voted against?
Mostly Arab nations, plus others like Turkey, India, Cuba, Greece.
And for it.
Key players like the U.S., the Soviet Union, France, Canada, Australia. The resolution called for power transfer by August 1st, 1948, but it didn't bring peace.
No, the sources say it was like a line drawn on water. It immediately triggered civil war.
Arab armed groups launched attacks across the country against Jewish areas.
And the Haganah had to step up again.
It transformed from a secret defense force into a more organized military, crucially with a sophisticated intelligence department. This was the beginning of what would become Mossad.
The British set their withdrawal date, May 14, 1948.
The day arrived.
And on that afternoon, May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv at the museum.
A simple ceremony. The national anthem, Hatikva. David Ben-Gurion stepped up, signed the Declaration of Independence.
Israel was declared. A baby republic, as one source calls it, born right into the middle of ongoing violence.
Gunfire, explosions, a chaotic birth.
Well, this deep dive really underscores the sheer complexity. Layers upon layers of history, competing narratives, escalating conflict, all leading to this moment.
The Declaration of Israel was huge, obviously. But, as our sources hint, the story was far from over. Arab armies were already massing on the borders.
Which leaves us with a question for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, the deep historical grievances, the fights over names and land, the cycle of violence, how might these foundational issues have almost guaranteed the decades of conflict that followed? What does it tell us about how history continues to shape the present and the immense challenges of finding peace?